You are at the Willamette Valley Injunction Deep Drawdown public meeting. This is an information session that will start with a presentation and will be followed at the end with a 15-minute Q&A session. We'll get to as many questions as possible. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. It will go directly to me. And during the Q&A session, I'll read out each of the questions and have our presenters respond. Like I said, I'll get through as many questions as possible. And with that, I will hand it over to our first presenter, Mr. Dustin Bankston. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Kelly. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for making the time in a busy week for us to pass along a little information on this year's injunctions. Don't worry if you aren't able to get the QR code to work. We will provide this website again at the end, and that's the opportunities to get to that information in multiple ways. Next slide, please, Kelly. The intent tonight is for us to provide just a little bit of background on the Willamette system and the injunction that we have been working to implement, or the injunction measures we've been working to implement for the last several years. And then we'll focus in on, downstream fish passage, some of the results that we've had over the last year. I know primarily the focus and interest is on the deep drawdown measures that we implemented at Green Peter and Lookout Point last year, and we will talk about where we are with those measures and changes to those operations for this year, how we will monitor, and then we'll provide, again, access to where you can find this information and stay current, as well as doing some Q&A. So next slide, Kelly. In terms of background, I show the next slide, which is this overview of all the projects in the system. Because it's a reminder, and I think many folks know this, that we operate the Willamette Valley as a system of projects to try to accomplish the multiple purposes that we have authorities to operate these dams for. Every one of these dams is a little bit different, both in terms of where and how they were constructed, and the specific features, in particular to tonight's presentation and issues, the features that we have to work with to try to improve conditions for listed species in the basin, something we have been working on for a long, long time. The trade-offs that we make, and there aren't easy answers to this, there's tension between all of those authorized purposes, flood risk management being primary, and then once we move beyond issues that would concern public safety downstream, those other purposes are about trying to use the stored water, the infrastructure that we have to achieve the best balance of benefits while meeting our legal requirements. And that certainly is illustrated by where we have been in the last several years. Next slide, Kelly. We operate these dams for those purposes in somewhat similar ways and have for a long time. The picture in front of you is our water control, our generic version of our water control diagram. Every one of our projects has its own water control diagram. Each are a little bit different, but all function in similar ways. And I think it's important to understand how we manage risk and opportunity over the course of the year. So if you look at the diagram and you look at the top, you see us going from major flood season to conservation storage season, through conservation use season and major flood season. And on the bottom, you see months of the year. That red line, that hard red line, is our rule curve. It's that kind of fixed authorization that we have at each project, and we have some limitations on how far we can deviate from that curve because we, want to make sure that there's nothing that compromises public safety and our flood risk management mission downstream. But each dam, as we get to February, we slowly start to refill these reservoirs as major flood season or the risks around flood season start to diminish. And we store as much water as we can, achieving that peak storage sometime in early May. And then we start to work through what's typically considered conservation use season. So that's where we balance flows out of the system to try to meet our legal requirements, flow targets downstream, improve water quality, generate power, the authorities that I think most folks are familiar with. And as we get to the end of conservation use season, you see us returning and pulling those pools back down to our normal low pool levels in most cases so that we can store water during winter storm events. Now, there have been a number of changes in terms of how that is operated as we try to modify our operations, improve downstream fish passage, downstream water quality conditions, habitat for listed species, but they all kind of function in the same way, and we'll get into a little bit later the specifics of how we're doing that this year around Lookout Point and Green Peter. Next slide, Kelly. So just a quick refresh, we have been working under a biological opinion since 2008 for the listed species in the basin, and completed a number of actions under that BIOP. In March of 2018, a lawsuit was filed, and the plaintiffs sued the Corps based on noncompliance with the Endangered Species Act for failure to fully implement that biological opinion. In around that same time, about April of 2018, we started to revise our Willamette Valley environmental impact statement, something that had been in place largely untouched since 1980. And I want to distinguish, this is a good point for us to distinguish between what we're doing now, which is compliance under an injunction, a court order, and another process that's been going on for a couple of years, and that's the update to the EIS. And so there were questions in an earlier session, but right now what we're focusing on tonight is the compliance side of this current injunction, and we will speak to a little bit, but in separate meetings, certainly in the future, where we're at with the new BIOP and the updated EIS. But in 2020, the court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs on all claims, and the judge's injunction ordered us to carry out a number of specific measures to improve fish passage and water quality in the basin. That decision is a legal requirement, and we have to meet those requirements unless the judge either grants us relief or when we see the new BIOP issued. And since last year, about this same time when we started implementation of these deeper drawdown measures, we've been going through a process of evaluation to see where we can improve those for any number of reasons. And in September of 24, the judge granted our motion adopting a revised version of the Green Peter Drawdown Implementation Plan, and we'll talk specifics about that later as well. Next slide, Kelly. As just kind of an overview of the types of measures we're talking about, and a number of these have been in place for a while, but don't necessarily create as much public attention or concern as the deeper drawdowns. The completion of that, as I mentioned, our reinitiated ESA consultation and the issuance of a new biological opinion by December of 24 is specified in the judge's order. That will lay out a number of actions for us over a span of time that we will have to comply with. It also included operational measures for fish passage and water quality in places where, in the spring, you will see us spilling more water out of a number of our facilities in an attempt to move fish out of our reservoirs, juvenile fish downstream through spill operations, and then changes in reservoir elevations, both in terms of delayed refills and deep drawdowns to try to move fish through existing fish passage structures where we believe we can do that successfully. It also included structural measures. Construction of the Dexter Fish Facility is underway and expected to be completed in 2026. We're working on structural improvements below Big Cliff Dam to reduce dissolved gas, which has impacts on fish below the dams at times, and working on the cougar regulating outlet modifications to make those less impactful as we try to optimize that route for fish passage as well. Through all of this, we're performing research, monitoring, and evaluation to understand how successful those operations are, what we can do to improve on them, and adapt to what we learn. While we're doing all of these things, which are unique and challenging in some ways, we are still doing routine operations and maintenance, and that's created some real tight schedules for us to adhere to and some specific communication around emergencies. All of this, everything that we're doing, everything we will talk about tonight becomes summarized for the court so that we can demonstrate not only compliance with those measures, but help build understanding around how we might modify those in the future. So with that, I'm going to Kelly, go ahead to the next slide. I'm going to transition this over to Mr. Greg Taylor, who's worked in the basin for a number of years on fish passage issues and he will talk about both the mechanics of operational fish passage and then a little bit about what we learned in year one. So Greg, can you able to?
Got it.
Got it.
Yeah, so thanks, Dustin, and thanks everyone for being here tonight. What I hope you walk away with tonight is just a better understanding of the mechanics of the drawdown and why we're using this particular tool to accomplish downstream fish passage. I think, having some of that understanding is really helpful. So, when we look at operations just in general to do things to improve conditions for fish at these dams, what's always true is there are always some impacts and there's some benefits of any particular approach that we're going to take. Structural, operational, any kind of change we're going to make at this dam, we're going to have a set of, impacts and benefits associated with that. So what we try to do is understand those trade-offs. And then in understanding the trade-offs, we try to make a decision on the path forward for what's the best approach to get the most benefit ultimately as we implement one of these operations. These trade-offs are obvious things. If we draw a pool down and we go below the point in the reservoir that we cannot produce hydropower anymore, that's a trade-off between our authorized purposes, right? So some of these trade-offs are between the authorized purposes that we have, but they're not limited to that. They also happen to be within the fish themselves. And so many times we'll take an action and it's good for one species and not necessarily good for another. And even within a single species, something we might do for an adult salmon may not be as beneficial for a juvenile salmon. So we're constantly evaluating these things. We're constantly trying to understand the trade-offs and pick the best path forward. Next slide. One of the tools in our toolbox as we're looking at things we can do to operate the system better is drawdowns. And we started using drawdowns in this basin early on. I know they've gotten a lot of focus the last couple of years, and rightly so, but we did a drawdown back at Fall Creek in 1968 and have used drawdowns in that particular basin many times over the years. So this is a tool that's available to us at certain projects to be done certain ways that can really result in some improvements to fish passage, both in terms of the fish passage efficiency, the number of fish that get out of the dam, and their survival. And that's really, given the ruling that we're working under, we were looking for tools that we could use to improve passage and water quality. And these drawdowns are one of the things we can use to do that. Next slide. So the way this works, and you can use this for Green Peter or Lookout Point Dam, is key thing to understand here is the spring Chinook juvenile salmon that we're trying to target with these operations are surface oriented. That means they live in the top 10 to 50 feet of the water, generally speaking. In the spring, when things are a little bit cooler, they'll tend to be closer to the surface. When it gets a little bit warmer, they'll move down, but they're still very surface oriented. So when we fill the project, we have three potential ways for these fish to move downstream: the spillway, the penstock, and the regulating outlet. And that spillway is a safe route for these fish. So you've seen many of these dams with Lookout, Detroit, Green Peter. In the spring and summer, we're spilling water. And we're really accomplishing two primary things there. We're improving downstream temperatures, so we get a water quality benefit, and we're providing a safe route of passage downstream for these juvenile fish. So we really get those two benefits. But as we pull the project down, as we would during any winter, next slide, Kelly. we're left with only two options at that point. And really those options are the penstock or the turbine unit and our regulated outlet gates. And so at Green Peter, at the Lookout, we have these high head Francis units. We know from many studies that have been done over the years that these are generally not safe routes through these particular turbine units. And so it's just not a viable passage alternative for us if we want to provide safe passage for these fish. The regulating outlets, on the other hand, are generally safe or safer. And so in looking at a way to provide safe passage during this window in the fall and the winter, the regulating outlet was the obvious choice. The only challenge with the regulating outlet is for fish to be able to actually find it. Again, because they're surface oriented and our regulating outlets are generally quite deep, we really have to narrow up the depth of where the fish are to where that intake is. So what we're shooting for is about 25 feet. Next slide, Kelly. And we'll pull that pool down to within 25 feet, roughly, of that regulating outlet. And that allows these juvenile fish to find that safe route out of the project. And, that's really the rationale for this particular operation and how we've used this particular tool over the years at different projects around the Willamette. Next slide. So I'm going to use some really high-level summaries from 2023, and this is specific to Green Peter. First of all, we saw large numbers of kokanee salmon pass downstream, and based on what we observed, we think it's going to be very difficult to continue to maintain that sport fishery. There were just really large numbers of those fish. As the drawdown progressed, many of those fish were alive, but they ended up in foster or continued to migrate downstream into the Willamette. But I don't believe there's going to be meaningful numbers of fish remaining in Green Peter to maintain a sport fishery. Ultimately, the state of Oregon, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife manages those fisheries. I know they're looking at options. They've also indicated they think it's going to be pretty difficult as well. So anyway, I just want to make sure that people are tracking that we did observe these really large numbers of kokanee passing downstream. Our juvenile Chinook, we had test fish because we wanted to make sure we could really track these fish and carefully examine how they performed. Those fish migrated out of Green Peter at a relatively high rate, so about 90% of them. And this is what you'd expect. We've been able to use this tool, like I mentioned before in the past. We've seen a similar result where we get really high numbers of these fish to move effectively out of the project. So no surprise there. We also saw relatively good survival, not as high as we'd hoped, to be quite candid, but we're looking into that some more. I will point out that survival is significantly better than the turbine unit, so it's definitely an improvement over that particular route. So the survival is better for sure. And then the last thing to pass along is that, we're really targeting the naturally produced Chinooks, so the ones that are being produced by the fish that go up and spawn in the Middle Santiam and in Quartzville Creek above Green Peter. And we saw very low numbers of those fish. And we don't know why for sure, but that's what we saw this first year, just very low numbers of those fish that were actually captured downstream of the dam. And I can talk about that more in detail with other folks if they have questions around that. But those numbers were quite low. Next slide. And as Dustin mentioned, we're monitoring all of this. So we're using a variety of techniques. We're going to do this over many years. And then we're going to take all that information and put it together to try to paint this picture of these individual operations and how they're working, and whether they're a tool that is going to be a tool we can use long term to really improve the status of these fish, and specifically some of these areas above the dams. So this is a really key component. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to make this happen. And we're just kind of in the first phase, at least with the drawdowns themselves. But we're collecting lots of good data, and ultimately we're going to be able to have, I think, real clear insight into how effective these particular drawdowns are. And that's what I have for fish.
Thanks, Greg. This is Catherine Tackley. I'm the Water Quality Lead with the Portland District Corps of Engineers. I also work in the Reservoir Regulation section, so the folks that help shape the dam operations and in particular these drawdowns. Next slide, please. I want to take just a little bit of time stepping through our drawdown plans. I'll start with Green Peter and then shift over to Lookout Point. This graphic right here is pretty data intensive, so I'll unpack the details here just for a minute. On the left, you can see pool elevation. Across the bottom is months, starting January, going through to December. The purple line is observed reservoir elevations, so where we've been. And then the colored blue lines that dovetail into that purple line, that's our forecasted drawdown. So in order to forecast dam operations, we use weather information, whether that be current forecasts or long-term forecasts to shape this drawdown operation. A couple other things to point out, the bolded black sort of flat-topped pyramid, that's our original rule curve. And then the dashed black line is the injunction curve. So as you can see, the purple and bluish green lines follow that injunction curve. That's our drawdown plan for this year. The dashed lines that run from left to right are the various boat ramps. BR stands for boat ramp. And as you can see, we've just drafted below Thistle boat ramp, so that is now unusable. If you were on this meeting last year, the Green Peter drawdown plan looked a little differently. As Dustin mentioned earlier in the presentation, we filed a motion with the court to reshape the Green Peter drawdown. That was based on impacts that we saw last year, primarily water temperature and some turbidity. So we're shaping this operation differently in an attempt to improve those conditions. So we've held Green Peter higher in the reservoir. That's provided an opportunity for additional access to the boat ramps. And then as you can see, next week we'll be drafting the reservoir faster to reach our drawdown targeted elevation of 780, which has been ordered by the court. We'll hold at elevation 780 for 30 days. We have a 2-week window in which to reach elevation 780. So sometime between 15 November and 1 December, we'll reach 780 and then we'll hold for 30 days before starting refill. Refill is not shown on this plot, but I do want to touch on it. Refill is very much driven by Mother Nature, rain events, inflows. If you recall last year, we refilled Green Peter very, very quickly. We had a series of rain events, some call them atmospheric rivers, that came over the region and inflows increased rapidly. To reduce downstream flooding, we began storing that water, stopped the operation, and began to refill. So refill may be a result of our flood mitigation actions, or refill may come after that 30-day window. And like I said, the subsequent rain events will drive how quickly we refill this reservoir back to our typical minimum winter pool elevation. The last thing I want to point out is the gold shaded area. This is when we anticipate elevated turbidity based on observations from last year. So we're getting close to the point in which we will start to see elevated turbidity and we expect elevated turbidity to continue throughout the drawdown. Next slide, please. This is a graphic of turbidity measured downstream of Green Peter Dam in 2023 and 2024. So you have FNUs, which is the amount of turbidity on the y-axis, date on the x-axis. To the left, that's the start of the drawdown from last year, and then going out to the right to present day. As you can see, and I'm sure most of you are aware, we did see high turbidity levels resulting from the deep drawdown. That first peak was the deep drawdown itself, and the second peak, while in a drawn down state, is when we started to see that uptick in high inflows from those atmospheric rivers or high rain events that I mentioned just a minute ago. While we are working on some numerical models or computer models to help us understand and predict future turbidity in relation to these deep drawdowns, that is a work in progress. So the minor amount of modeling that we've done suggests that we'll see elevated turbidity similar to last year. Next slide, please. This is a similar plot. This one is our drawdown plan for Lookout Point for 2024. Again, the purple line is where we've been. The colored sort of greenish blue line that dovetails that purple line is where we're headed. The dashed line is our injunction curve compared to our original rule curve, which is that flat top pyramid. As you can see, we're a little lower in Lookout Point Reservoir as compared to Green Peter. At Green Peter, we're only 5 feet below a typical winter elevation. At Lookout Point, we're already 30 feet below minimum conservation pool or that winter pool elevation. So our drawdown at Lookout Point is much more advanced. We did not reshape or try and modify the Lookout Point deep drawdown plan as compared to 2023. The reason for that is there is some continued landslide monitoring going on along Highway 58 and Union Pacific Railroad. We'd like to collect more information and ensure slope stability before shifting the drawdown and shaping it more like Green Peter. So we are drawing down similar at Lookout Point as compared to last year, whereas, like I said, with Green Peter, we've held on to that pool a little bit longer and are conducting a faster drawdown. For Lookout Point, based on 2023 observations, we would expect elevated turbidity to be occurring now, but next slide, please. As you can see, we still are seeing very low turbidity levels, which are the blue lines to the very right of this plot. We still do expect elevated turbidity downstream of Lookout Point as we continue the drawdown, but interestingly enough, turbidity levels are less this time round as compared to last year. I was out at Lookout Point Reservoir last week, and it does appear that the river has found the channel that it cut last year. So a lot of the turbidity that was moved downstream last year was a result of the upper part of that reservoir shifting from a lake to a river, and that river had to find its channel. And so it cut through sediment that has settled in the reservoir over the past 70 or so years, and in doing so, that river cut its channel and moved sediment downstream. It appears that river found the channel and all the work it put into cutting a channel, and so with that, there is some promise that turbidity will be less than last year, but we're still collecting information, and at this point are planning for similar levels of turbidity. Next slide, please. Okay, monitoring. Next slide. We're conducting more monitoring this year than last. So last year we funded the U.S. Geological Survey to collect real-time turbidity gauge data at 7 gauges. This year, we've increased the number of gauges to 11. This is real-time turbidity data that is publicly accessible. I'll provide links to that data here in a minute. And in addition to turbidity, we're also monitoring for water temperature and dissolved oxygen. And on top of that, the USGS is also collecting suspended sediment concentration samples. And that information will be fed into those computer models that I mentioned that will help us to predict turbidity and sediment movement sources and sinks in the future. Next slide, please. We also collected sediment samples in Green Peter and Foster reservoirs. We'll start with the map of Green Peter. As you can see, this is a continuation of some sampling we did back in 2013. So the red dots are the sampling sites where we collected samples in 2013. The yellow dots are the 2024 sampling sites. As you can see, we moved those sampling sites in 2024 closer to that river channel where we saw a lot of sediment movement. And we just recently received the 2024 data. It is still preliminary, but it does show, just like it did in 2013, that contaminants are very, very low in Green Peter Reservoir. Heavy metals and pesticides are well below levels of concern. Next slide, please. This is the map of Foster. Again, the red dots are the 2013 sampling sites. The yellow dots are the 2024 sampling sites. And again, all results show that levels of contaminants are low and below levels of concern. Next slide. Okay, next slide, please. This is an image of our Willamette Injunction website. So we've improved upon this website quite a bit. In this website, you'll find the final court order, our implementation plans, all of our biannual status reports that have been submitted to the court. There's now 6 of them. Current reservoir elevation data, links to real-time turbidity levels, and some Q&A information. I encourage you to go to this website. You can either use the QR code or jot down that website, or what I do is just Google Willamette Injunction, and this website will pop right up. But you can track conditions in real time at this site. Next slide, please. So in summary, the court, as you all know, is under a court injunction order to draw down Green Peter and Lookout Point reservoirs, as well as a few other reservoirs, as well as carry out other measures that Dustin touched on earlier in the presentation. And the deep drawdowns are expected to improve conditions for downstream fish passage and survival of ESA-listed fish. And we continue to collect biological and other information to better understand the impacts of the drawdowns. We anticipate the deep drawdowns will result in elevated turbidity again this year, and we're continuing to monitor those conditions. Refill will start at the end of the 30-day window for these deep drawdowns unless Mother Nature dictates otherwise. We expect to refill back to minimum conservation pool, or the minimum winter pool elevation. And then as we move into spring and summer, we'll refill back to full pool according to our rule curves. Next slide, please. Lastly, I just want to mention that we are working on a deep drawdown emergency response and communications plan. And this plan identifies criteria and a process for the city, state, and court to work through in the event the deep drawdowns have negative impacts on the municipal drinking water facilities located downstream of Green Peter or Lookout Point reservoirs. And I believe that's my last slide, and we can open it up for question and answer. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Catherine. Hello again, this is Kelly James. I'm the meeting facilitator and the chat monitor. And if you have questions, please feel free to continue submitting them via chat on your lower right-hand corner. You can find that. I've been monitoring the chat and I have a list of questions ready for our presenters to answer. So I'll start with the first one. Do you foresee the future of Foster and or Green Peter Dam eventually being taken down, as seems to be the objective of environmental activists? I know many say it will never happen, but these dams are primarily for flood control. But many will counterpoint that flood control is not a guarantee the dams will remain.
Yeah, Kelly, and I think I'll answer this since I answered it in the earlier session. And having worked in the Valley for a long time, this subject or this question comes up frequently around any changes we have in the system. And certainly as you see dam removals in different parts of the West happening, understand why this comes up again. To be absolutely clear, we have no charge, no authority, no direction to study removal of the dams. That was asked at the beginning of our update to the EIS. I think, the answer we've been providing consistently is that we're working within our existing authorities. So there is not a direction for us to study this as part of our operations. What we're trying to do is understand and optimize our operations so that we can improve conditions for listed species and, maintain as much of the benefits or the balance of benefits as we can for the other purposes that we can operate these dams. This question is not going to go away, and I don't think that there's any, it certainly wouldn't be responsible for us to speculate on the future, but if you really look at the conditions around some of these other dam removal projects, I think you will see very different purposes for those facilities, and the flood risk management mission in the Willamette Valley certainly is a prime driver. The population at risk downstream is enormous, as well as the infrastructure. So the best that I can answer that question without speculating on the future, which probably wouldn't be appropriate, would be that we're currently not working on any analysis associated with dam removal at this time.
Thank you, Dustin. Next question starts with a comment. Mercury has been documented to be in the sediments of Green Peter Reservoir due to historic gold mining activity. The last drawdown showed a large increase in sediments in Mercury and Foster Reservoir. The amount of mercury in sediments removed in water treatment and how they are used and the mercury levels in fish need to be addressed. Has this been done yet? What are the mercury levels in the sediment? Was mercury analyzed?
Yeah, Kelly, this is Catherine. I'll take that one. Yes, mercury was analyzed in the sediment samples collected from both Green Peter and Foster Dam. Mercury does exist in the sediments. These are volcanic rich soils. Heavy metals do exist, but they're very, very low from our samples, well below the freshwater screening criteria, and even lower than DEQ's background levels. We will be placing this data on our website for everyone to access. It's still going through quality control. We're just checking the data and working with the lab to make sure that I's are dotted, T's are crossed. So as soon as this data is checked for quality control, we will post it. Just for everyone's awareness, we are also meeting with the drinking water providers and the states routinely, and they too have requested this data, and so we also plan to share it with those folks as well.
Thank you, Catherine. Next question is, our only native run is this arm, in this arm is the winter steelhead. Why are we focusing on a run on Chinook spawning? That was a wild run that people tried to start rather than ensure we don't hurt our actual native run.
I can take that one, Kelly. So if you go back and look at the documentation, back, way back into the 30s, it's very clear that there were spring Chinook salmon historically in the South Santiam above the Foster Dam site, in the Middle Santiam above the Green Peters site, and in Quartzville Creek. And in fact, if you look at the historic distributions and just kind of roughly break that down, about 70% of the spawning and rearing habitat in the system was above these dams. So it's well documented. There are populations that have been identified. We mitigated for those populations above those sites when we put the dams in. So that wouldn't have happened if they weren't there. And we're going to continue to work to try to improve the status of the fish by trying to improve these populations by accessing some of those habitats above the dam. That is the one chance that these fish have to improve their status, is to access these areas above the dams. So it's well documented, and something we're working towards.
Thank you, Greg. Next question. The temps in the water last year hurt the native eggs from the winter steelhead and the Chinook, and this was proven and admitted by the very people doing the studies. Why are we continuing to hurt the fishery we are supposedly trying to help? It seems the goal isn't about the fish if we are knowingly hurting them while killing all of the kokanee.
Yeah, this is Catherine. Greg, you want to take this one? Go ahead.
Well, it's kind of fish focused. If there's, I'll start with the fish pieces of it, and then maybe you can add to it. So that's the reason we include this slide, or I included the slide that I did in this presentation, which talks about trade-offs. Is this is exactly the kind of scenario that plays out at these dams. When you make a change, you're going to have some benefits associated with it, and you're going to have some potential impacts. One of the impacts that we saw coming out of this operation last year was that the temperatures in the South Santiam, as measured below Foster, were definitely higher than what we'd like to see. No getting around that. I mean, that's just how it was. And so the very reason that we went back to the court and modified the operation was to address that impact. And so we did some, and maybe Catherine can talk about this part, but we did some water quality or some temperature modeling. And what it suggested is that we needed to just keep more water in the reservoir later, and then do the drawdown a little bit more aggressively to try to minimize that impact. So it is a real impact. It's something that we're going to all get to see how much better it got with the modification that we made, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I'll add on that, if you swim in these lakes, you understand that the temperature varies from the surface, the top of the lake to the bottom. So when you're swimming in the lake, warm on the surface and your toes are cold. So as we draw these reservoirs down, we tend to release cold water from the dam, leaving that warmer surface water on top. What happened last year is there was a lot of warm surface water left in the reservoirs as we conducted the drawdown. That lake did not have enough time to cool off. In the fall, air temperatures cool down. We get shorter days, longer nights. Those lakes eventually lose all their heat back to the atmosphere. Because we drew down earlier last year, released a lot of cold water, we were left with this warm water. And so when drawdown time came and we were left with just one set of outlets to use, the regulating outlets, we were releasing warm water, and that was during a time of year that was unnatural. So by slowing down the drawdown, so allowing the surface of that reservoir or lake to cool off, and then starting the drawdown, is going to result in cooler overall temperatures in the lake for release through those regulating outlets.
Thank you. Next question is, the turbidity is going to do the same this year, and the faster drawdown will collapse the walls faster, and you guys know it. Why isn't this being taken into account?
Maybe I'd start and then I'd ask Catherine to fill in there. I think Greg answered part of this question in terms of, we know that there's going to be turbidity this year, and the modification in our operation is very focused on trying to improve temperatures. What's interesting, I think, when you kind of follow these drawdowns, just normal drawdowns that we do, and if you've ever been in the air to see it, where you see the greatest amount of erosion is on the edges of these reservoirs as the wind kind of moves water off and on. So there's erosion that happens in that way as well. There's a possibility that this drawdown will improve that condition, and I think we see a little bit of preliminary kind of observations at Lookout Point where we've had the channels start to recut themselves, and we haven't seen that turbidity increase. And then I kick it over to Catherine because I know we're going to be doing some sediment modeling and collecting data to support that into the future, which is probably the more kind of quantitative way to answer this question. Catherine?
Yeah, thanks, Dustin. Yeah, so, we've started to build out these computer models and look at drawdowns, not only in Green Peter and Lookout Point reservoirs, but elsewhere, so pulling information anywhere we can while we continue to collect data, at the specific reservoirs. And we don't expect the faster draft rate to have any meaningful impact on turbidity. That turbidity, the source of that turbidity came from that river, or the upper end of the reservoir, converting from lake to river, finding its channel. We anticipate that river will find that channel that it cut last year. We're hopeful for improved turbidity, although to be cautious, we continue to, caution folks that turbidity levels will still be high. This is only the second year drawdown. It's likely we'll see turbidity impacts for years to come before the reservoir and the river have sort of cleared all of the sediment that's collected over the year. But let's put it this way, we wouldn't have modified this operation if we thought it was going to make things worse.
All right, next question. Why, after the SCOTUS ruling that the court cases using Chevron defense were unconstitutionally ruled, are we not fighting against the case from the Endangered Species Act, which is what is being used to drive this entire drawdown? I will unmute you, Victoria.
Sorry, Kelly, who did you have?
Trying to unmute Victoria.
Hi.
Oh, there you
Yeah,
go.
she should be unmuted now.
Yeah, can you hear me, guys?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, all right, sorry, I just hit my unmute button on my phone and not *6, so that explains that. Hi, everybody, I'm Victoria Frankeney. I'm an attorney with the Army Corps of Engineers. I don't know if I could exactly answer this question. I'm kind of a little confused. I don't know if it's something that's posed more gently. I will indicate that the ruling did come from a federal court judge, and so we are abiding by that order. Apologies for not being able to answer your question a little bit more clearly.
You're welcome to put in the chat any clarifications if you'd like to the person who submitted this question. Next question, if they don't plan to take down the dams, why then, after they said they didn't have a plan to do so, did they have a meeting in Salem specifically about the removal of the dam?
Yeah, Kelly, and this is Dustin. I'll take this one. I think maybe what's being referred to here, the meetings we had last year around hydropower disposition. And we did have meetings in Salem. For those of you that were following, the Water Resources Development Act of 2022 required the Corps to provide a report to Congress on the federal interest in hydropower into the future. And so we had a couple of meetings to clarify both the intent in that process, because I think through that process there was some confusion over the relationship between our hydropower authority and the production of hydropower in the basin in the future, and the future of whether dams would be present. And as I said before, we are not engaging in any discussion, evaluation, reports to Congress on removal of the dams. We have provided that report up through our organization, and I'm not exactly sure tonight where that sits in terms of process, but that was very specific to our hydropower authority and nothing else.
Thank you, Dustin. There is one last question that has been submitted in the chat. That doesn't mean we don't have time for a few more if folks are still mulling them over and wants to enter them in. The last question is, you just said that the fish stay on top 15 feet of the lake. Your answer makes no sense to the temperature issue.
Yeah, I may have to get a little bit of clarification. There's multiple, maybe this is where the confusion is. So the temperature issue that we're trying to make sure that we resolve is in how we overall are managing the lake so that the downstream temperatures where the eggs are incubating from fish that spawn below the dam are not impacted. Okay, that's point one. Within the reservoir, the fish themselves, the juveniles that are rearing in Green Peter Reservoir, they regulate the depth that they live at within the reservoir in part based on temperature. So as it gets warmer in the summer, we tend to see them generally down a little bit deeper. And anybody that fishes for trout or kokanee or even the juvenile Chinook knows that you have to fish a little bit deeper in the summer because the fish move down a little bit. They're still relatively surface oriented though. So if you have an additional question, and maybe I didn't get at your question, yeah, ask another one, and I'll try to do my best to answer it.
All right, I'm not seeing any additional questions. We do have a few more minutes till the end of the hour, so I'm happy to hang on here and see if anyone has any additional questions they'd like to enter into the chat. And while we're waiting for any additional questions, please go ahead and switch to the final couple slides. So we do have some high-level information, an informational flyer available for download at our website, can use this QR code. I'll also put the website in the chat for folks' easy access. On that website, you'll be able to access this recording, the recordings from our other meetings that we're holding this week, as well as the final slide deck and this flyer that you can print out and provide to other people that may be interested. And for those who maybe didn't make the meetings, can still look at those recordings. If you go to the next slide, we do have one final meeting on October 11th, this coming Friday from noon to 1. If you'd like to attend that, all meeting recordings will be available on the website with all the Q&A sessions included. So if you're interested in other questions that folks might ask at those meetings, you're welcome to review those recordings. And our folks will stay on the line until the to the top of the hour for any last minute meeting or questions, which I just got one. Is Friday's meeting to repeat of this one? Yes, Friday's meeting will be the exact same presentation with a 15-minute Q&A session at the end. All right, I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat. So thank you all very much for your time tonight. We appreciate it. And I'll be closing out the recording right now. Have a great evening.